Hi, welcome to AI Impacts. Today we are talking with a very good friend of mine, Mark Bridgett. Mark is an SRE slash DevOps engineer. I'm sure he'll describe himself better. That's kind of, that's what he does. Like I say, I've known Mark for a long time. Mark and I have always had an interest in technology. Our careers have gone off in sort of slightly different directions, but Mark's been a lifelong learner for tech, and he's recently started to, well, not so recently, actually, a few years ago, he started to learn a bit more about machine learning, and he started to implement a bit more AI. Mark also does some interesting stuff with local AI deployments. So, yeah, Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, good to be here.
Cool, good to have you. So I'll give you a bit of an introduction there. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to fill in. You want to introduce yourself to the listener?
No, I guess all I can say is AI has come along quite a long way since we used it on Commodore 64s. What should I say? It wasn't there when we originally started our IT careers in our bedrooms back then, and just progressing over the years and the various things that we can kind of do with our computers has been nothing other than just like amazing, really. And it's incredible that we're sitting here now having conversations like these, things that we could only dream of like 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, it is. It's things that you would only, you'd see in movies, and you'd I know obviously movies can portend the future and things, but like some of the stuff that we're seeing now is you never really thought it would be realistic. Speaking of which, I guess, obviously, everybody has seen the evolution of AI over the last 2 years specifically. Obviously, AI has been gathering steam behind the scenes and less of a public eye for a longer period of time. But over the last 2 years, there's been a huge uptake of use of AI. I just wonder, how do you currently use AI in your, which tools do you use in your like day-to-day life?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of tools, at the minute, I'm running like local AI models. So I had a little bit of downtime recently to delve into running AI locally. And part of that kind of learning for me was to set up like a coding setup, so I could have not only like a language model running that I could sort of chat with and ask questions to, but also one integrated with my development tool set. So Visual Studio Code, there are tools that you can use to integrate like a locally running model with that. So you can like highlight sections of code and ask questions about it and have the model respond. And then I can also have like a chat window with like general questions that I might be asking it that are non like contextual in nature. So I guess I've just moved from running kind of like using things like chat.GPT and pasting in code into those windows as and when I need to do that to using them like directly running on AI, running on my own systems.
That's cool. And what's the difference? What's the main difference between using like a ChatGPT versus like a local install?
I guess the really interesting thing for me is that like the demystifying of what it actually takes to run these things. So when ChatGPT landed and we all started using it for whatever reason, like we were just blown away with what it did. And then you'd get these news stories of how many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that certain companies were using to build out like GPU infrastructure in order to train these models. So there's always that there's always that kind of like that mystique of like, well, surely it's going to cost like massive amounts of money to do these things yourself. And then I guess all I managed to do was like pick up a few things on LinkedIn or Twitter as to running your own AI and how easy it was. And it was only when I got some downtime, I actually looked into what you're actually doing in order to run these things. And running your own AI is like, first of all, you need to have an open source model. So ChatGPT is an open source. So you need to use something like Llama 2 from Meta. So you can download a Llama 2 model, and then you'll need to download a version that is kind of like an appropriate size for the level of computer hardware that you're running. And then once that's running, there are a myriad of tools that you can use to just run these things, and it will download the model automatically. It will set them all up for you, and it'll just give you a chat window, and you're basically good to go. So it's just like installing a Windows package or a Linux package, and then just running them, and then just using a few prompts.
I know you mentioned there obviously about a bit of the appropriate sizing of your of the model that you download. I know from talking to you that you had initially you had a bit of an issue sort of working that out.
Yeah, so that was kind of trial and error to begin with. So like my own computer at home, it's pretty meaty, but it was pretty meaty for like 3 years ago. It cost me like 6 grand. Whereas like when I started to download models, thinking, oh, I'll be able to run this, like you would type in it, well, it would load the model, and you would ask a question, and then there'd be this like massive long pause, and then you might get like 4 words every 10 seconds or something. And you're thinking, well, this is not the chat GPT experience that I'm used to.
Yeah.
And then you get a bit.
I was going to say, that's what I was going to ask about, just regards to the actual like size and capacity that you can actually get out of an LM. Because one, I'm surprised to even hear that it's that easy to roll it out locally. I thought that would be something that's a pretty like dev heavy endeavor to be able to kind of get this thing stable, to even have the hardware requirements. I'm even surprised that you're able
George,
to do
Mark's
that.
version of easy might not be our version of
okay.
easy.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. But can you give me a kind of like a sense of the capacity limitations, the differences between like a chat GPT 3.5 or something and your local LM?
So ultimately, when a model is trained, it's going to be a certain file size, and that file size represents the number of parameters that the neural network that they've trained behind the scenes takes up, and the number of parameters, which is the complexity, and is the file size, that needs to be loaded onto your computer. Now, there are various ways of almost like downsampling that model. So when it's trained in a data center, it will be like almost like a really high fidelity version.
Okay.
So, for example, like I think X released a version of Grok recently, and it was something like 148 billion parameters. So you need 148 gigabytes at least of GPU VRAM in order to run that model. Oh, and most people don't even have 148 gigabytes of system RAM, let alone VRAM, because most like consumer graphics cards will top out at around like 24 gigabytes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So like I've got a NVIDIA 4090, and that's got 24 gigabytes of VRAM, and that's like top spec consumer grade product. Now, what you can get is you can get like a downsampled version of these models. You can't get it for Grok, but you can get it for like Llama 2 or StarCoder or Gemma, which is Google's version. Mm-hmm. And the lower and lower fidelity versions, they're not going to be as accurate, but they've become more and more able to run on like a really fast PC or whatever, all the way down to like a MacBook running just like a current MacBook could run like a decently complex model. But you've just got to pick the appropriate size for the amount of like system RAM and CPU that you've got, and also whether there's like an integrated like GPU on your system as well.
And that's still taking the like most of the capacity of the computer, I'm assuming, when you're running
right? you could find a model which is like 4 gigabytes in size, and it's not going to take up like many resources. Once you start getting into ones that take up like 16 or 17 gigabytes, it's going to start requiring like a really powerful system to run. But I think the most interesting thing for me was the fact that it was possible. And I think that what I always assumed was that AI was something running in a data center, and that you were able to like ask questions of it, but not necessarily run it yourself in 2024. Mm-hmm. And it's possible. You can do it.
And so what do you lose if you go from like the 100 plus gigabyte version down to like a 16, 17 gigabyte version? What's the trade-off?
So, I mean, this is kind of where my knowledge runs out. So I'm going to give you kind of like my layman's perspective on it. But ultimately, it's the bit, like you can get like a 16-bit model or an 8-bit model or a 4-bit model, and it's basically the accuracy of the outputs. And those outputs are ultimately what generate the tokens, which are like the text output that you might get when you're asking a language model. So ultimately, a lower like bit model will have a lower accuracy and will potentially give incorrect answers. But you can get models that are like quite stripped down, but they'll still give like pretty high quality results for what you need to do. So it's that kind of like trade-off. Obviously, you're never going to get as good as just like asking ChatGPT for a question, but you can get pretty damn close running on your own hardware at home.
And are those models that the models, the sort of the data size, can you have that purely sort of contextualized. So instead of having like 128 gigabyte of learning on, general language model, you could have 20 gig learning, how to code like a ninja.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a model called StarCoder. And StarCoder is just trained on like coding. So it's just for that one purpose. And you can get various versions of that model. So you can get one that's trained on like 10 programming languages, and then you can get one that's trained on 100 programming languages. So you can start to get more and more specific about what you want to, what you're interested in. And then obviously you can get something more specific, and then you can get something at a higher sort of quality or bit rating. So you can start to like focus really, like you can zero in on kind of like what you're interested in and get a model that is like specifically focused on that. So yeah.
Huh.
I think that's really interesting as well, isn't it? This sort of specificity, because people assume, a lot of people assume that you go to ChatGPT and that's kind of what AI offers you. It's people will tell you, oh, AI is not great at writing documents, or AI is not great at writing code. It can do it, but it's not particularly skilled at that. But actually, what we're saying is, and what we're seeing now is, obviously these really sort of custom or specialized or targeted AIs, which are very, very good at those specific things, but very not at all able to do the rest of the stuff. So they're becoming more like specialist employees.
Yeah, I guess when you're like introducing AI to like a wider audience, like having that like Swiss Army knife that it can do everything is like it's really good for like getting that initial kind of like buzz and generating sort of like awareness. Maybe as we get more mature, we can start to have AIs that are more specific to what we want to do. And then as another thing I might talk about later on is just in order to make these things personable, like they may need to become more specific so they can fit on consumer devices or become sort of more commoditized as well. So that's another reason why you might want to have something that's trained specifically on one thing, or just a narrow sort of subset of the world, really.
Cool. George, do we want to leave that as a teaser for later on, or should we delve into that now?
Yeah. I mean, it does remind me of the I think it was there's a million Copilot brands out there now these days, but the one, I think it was GitHub, was the first one that they actually were like, we're going to build an LLM that's just specifically for people to help write out code who basically are like novice or entry level, or someone like me who's like, I know that, like I do like web development stuff. So I'm like, I know that I need JavaScript here, but I can't write it myself. Was like kind of the perfect use there. So it's interesting to see that they're kind of going in these different directions and becoming more specific, but still the part that I'm always fascinated with is there's still this underlying ability that it needs to communicate back to someone in a novice way. Right. So there's like this expertise, but still this communication layer that always has to exist. And I don't know if that's something that ever gets tossed at a certain point where you just go like, no, I don't need you to communicate back to me. Like if there's an error, I'll debug it myself or something.
Yeah, I guess that gets you into the realm of like augmented like prompts, where you may be almost kind of like around a question that you may be asking of something. It has an overall context that you're also giving it before it answers a question. And I think you get a lot of that in AI and a lot of sort of the open AIs of the world,
the custom GPTs in ChatGPT are sort of that have that pre-built context.
Exactly,
which is
like behind
the general.
Yeah, behind the scenes, it's basically saying, with this question, answer in these terms, and do not do X, Y, and Z. And a lot of where we're going to with with something called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. That's when you can start to bring in like your own content to these models, as opposed to just using the ones that are already pre-trained. They are being used in addition to an LLM in order for you to get specific answers to questions based on things that you're already giving it ahead of time. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of like use these models for, but you can almost chain them together and use them as the last step in another before something else might have been used, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm interested in, just touched on, because it's triggered a story which was in my head. Obviously, you mentioned that Open API isn't an open source platform. I know there was a news story that I was following that was with Elon Musk, where he was an initial investor in Open API, and now he's taken them to court or having some litigation against them, and says that obviously He claims that his money's been misspent because it was supposed to be this open platform. He said he'll drop the case if they change the name to closed API.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there were also leaked emails where he wanted part of it to become like behind a paywall. So
there were there's certain who knows what the actual truth.
But it is one of the biggest ironies that, like, I mean, I can go onto Hugging Face, which is a place for AI models, and the one thing you can't find on there is anything from OpenAI because they don't release their own models for public consumption. So what is open about OpenAI currently? At least?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing at all.
Not
So what? Obviously, I mentioned in the intro that you your career path has taken you from. I remember, when we were young, you ran a business which was doing like websites. That was quite early on in that whole process. Mark and I are both quite old, and then so your career has sort of followed. You did SharePoint development and things like that. You moved on to Amazon. I guess there's always been this thing. You've always like looked for the next big thing. When was it? What was it that attracted you to AI, or when was it that you got attracted to AI and thought, actually, do you know what? This is something I want to, invest my time in.
It's a good question.
So, I think it was probably back in 2017, 2018. I wanted to move from being just a developer to being more like cloud and infrastructure based, and I noticed that Amazon Web Services was like the big dog, and also that the Amazon Web Services certifications were like some of the hardest in the industry. And if you could pass those, then you would get like X salary or whatever. And I found myself in the Netherlands on a gig once with nothing to do in the evenings. And I just thought, do you know what? I'm gonna train for an Amazon certification. And I trained for it and I passed it. And it was just one kind of not related to AI at all. And then over the next couple of years, I managed to just like keep grinding through these things. And I must say, it was before I had children. That's for sure. So I don't have any time to do these.
I remember you going through all these.
Anyway, I found myself on a new gig, and one of the guys I was working with, my line manager actually, I was checking him out on LinkedIn, and he had AWS machine learning specialty certification, and I was just like, wow, what is that all about? So I kind of like put that thought to sort of decide for a little while because I couldn't really apply to what I was doing in my job. And then it wasn't until COVID came around that I thought, right, I need to study for something new now that like I'm shut in the house for 23.5 hours per day. So I started to like learn about AI and machine learning, and it was more theoretical based than it was like related just to Amazon Web Services. And I found that really interesting. And what it did is it like really demystified like a lot of what this magic was behind the scenes and how pervasive AI and ML already is in our lives without us realizing. Things like spam filtering on websites, all those sorts of things. The auto completion on Gmail when you start typing something, that's generative AI. Or things like what's that?
I guess YouTube algorithms and
or you go to Netflix. Yeah, Netflix won't stop showing me like movies from the 1980s because it's using ML that is determined that like that's all I'm interested in.
That's all you want. That's it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's fair enough,
Stranger
right?
Things.
I mean, what?
So yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I studied for that certification, and I didn't just study like the course materials. I started to do more courses as well, just to make sure that I passed it. And then it just became really interesting, things like image recognition and how these things actually work behind the scenes using like neural networks, and then how neural networks could be used to predict, like to translate languages. And it was like by kind of like modeling how the human brain works and how sort of inputs and like outputs are sort of dictated by something in the middle, like the neuron, which is activated depending on certain inputs. I thought that was really fascinating. So, I mean, I got into it that way. And I was always trying to look for a way to integrate it into my job or find a project where we could use ML or that sort of thing. But it wasn't really until ChatGPT came about that we got that I got that second pulse of like, wow, we're really starting to use this now, at least kind of in the public domain. So, that was kind of how I started learning it. Yeah.
I hear the kids. You've not. So the thing is, this interesting thing, I guess, about AI and about technology is that specifically if we're learning about, you obviously spent a lot of time learning about ML. You really, you did a course on it, etc. And the more you learn about AI, the more technical sort of you've learned to deploy it. You've learned all this sort of stuff. But actually, would you consider yourself a user of AI or an expert in AI? I guess my point is AI more of a tool for you, or is it more of the fact that you like playing with it, developing it, and seeing how you can configure it?
Or has it become your companion?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess sometimes you see people online and they're almost integrating AI into like every aspect of their like lives, and you'll see YouTube videos of people using it to, like, I don't know, book hotel rooms, or kind of like almost just become like connected to the AI. Whereas for me, it's basically just like the logical next step for what we're doing with computers and how they kind of like help us with our day-to-day lives. So it's just there when I need it. Like, I'm using an ML when I talk to Alexa. I'll keep my voice quiet in case it triggers her. But now when I'm coding, or if something that I don't know about springs to mind, or I'm having an argument with someone, like the logical next step is to ask an LLM what the answer is, because like Googling it is just not sufficient anymore to answer a question. I'll primarily use an LLM to ask a question, but I'll just be mindful of the fact of like when it was trained and kind of like the limitations of those things. But for me, it's just kind of like the first thing you reach for when you're trying to do something technically. Or
that's interesting. So I'm the same with me. It's kind of replaced Google for me in terms of the go-to to ask, because it gives you much more rich contextual answers, and you can delve into those answers and you can interrogate them a little bit further and get more specific, and you don't have to wade through pages of responses and things. So
absolutely. And also, like, working in industries like we've worked in the past in crypto, like the amount of buzzwords that get thrown around by people, like assuming that you already know what like X, Y, and Z means. And then I'll be like on an LLM saying, so can you explain to me what this means in terms of Ethereum? Like, because you don't ever want to ask somebody that question, do you? In case you look, unless you feel stupid. But you can ask an LLM that question, and it's not going to tell on you behind the scenes, is it?
Yeah, Mark doesn't know what staking is. Don't tell.
Yeah, but I often find when you're working in crypto, actually, once you do ask those questions, everyone in the room thanks you for asking the questions, because a lot of people didn't fully understand it either. And also there's a lot of ambiguity. So what people with a lot of these terms in such a nascent industry as crypto, where there's a lot of new technology, a lot of these terms aren't totally neatly defined, and somebody might have slightly different assumptions. So yeah. But I agree, it is useful to be able to pull something else for information.
I find too that the context that, like, when I'm asking a question to ChatGPT, like I adopted a bunch of ducks, and I don't know anything about ducks. So there's a lot of like, can these 6-week-old white ducks living in this area survive for blah, 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 blah. And the answer I get is, it's exactly what I want. It's like, yes, or no, put them away, right? As opposed to me having to go through a whole bunch of searches and find is what this person's talking about even relevant to what I need?
You'd normally end up on like a duck forum, wouldn't you? And then you'd be asking
there is a duck Reddit,
specific duck question.
It is amazing. But,
is it called Who Gives a Duck?
It should be. Although maybe I should find out that domain and see if it's available. It's pretty good. But but like that level of context, it brings me back to like something like Perplexity. I don't know if you guys have used that search engine, but it's basically trying to span between like offering sources and actual places where things came from, both whether if they're newsworthy or if they're kind of informational, but giving you a summary and like a quick LLM spit out that's like a paragraph that's all cited. And I find myself using that quite a bit because it's actively going through its search results that it's found on the internet and using the LLM to read them and summarize it, as opposed to like with ChatGPT, it's just pulling an answer out of, wherever.
Yeah, this is interesting because this is what I mentioned RAG before, and like RAG is where you're like augmenting like search results with an LLM, using the LLM to almost like construct the sentences and answer in an appropriate way with a bit of its knowledge. But fundamentally, you're providing it with like a context that you've already like indexed and you've already searched beforehand. And I think, given what you just said about perplexity, I think that's one of the next logical steps, because we've got that whole issue around like who owns training data and who has been asked to provide that, and who really benefits. And I think, like, I've heard a few podcasts where people are debating whether like Google needs to almost like cannibalize its own search engine by using an AI, but then using that to drive people to websites or to sort of enable them to do things like book hotels. So connecting kind of these LLM outputs with where the information came from, or giving people more the ability to kind of like dig a little deeper than just kind of like that output. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah. And to attach it to some sort of author, I think, is also a big, that's, of course, New York Times is suing OpenAI over this very issue because of they basically gobble up the news every day. And then you can ask ChatGPT what the New York Times has behind their paywall, and it'll literally like tell you. Right. So it's something that no one should do that, by the way. We don't endorse this behavior. But I think that's something that, it is going to come up. It's going to be an impedance soon in the next year as these models are running out of information to consume anyway, that there has to be some other model, especially from a revenue perspective, to actually say we want users to be able to use this over and over without cannibalizing ourselves, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's someone I follow on Twitter related to kind of like an investment topic that I'm interested in. And like, she posted a picture a few days ago of like an AI generated image, and it was an image of her. Okay. So obviously like that AI has used training data of her to produce an image, which more or less looks like 95% like her. And like, does she get a say in that, or where that's going to be used? So like the royalties aspect and kind of all those other things, that's a really interesting area. But I think one of the things I've heard and I agree with is like, how far do we go before we start to put the lid on these things, or we start to legislate around them? And we want to allow innovation, but we don't want to almost like kind of strangle it before it's really started to show us what we can do. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's an interesting thing really, because
it is an interesting question, but I think there's going to be a point where legislation becomes meaningless because this stuff can just outstrip legislation, and it's like it's got a life of its own, and it's so the technological advancements will just make a mockery of legislation, I think, in many ways.
I think the private sector
trying to legislate for kids access to nefarious materials online, right? I mean, you can put in all the legislation in the world, but kids are going to access stuff. That's just how it goes, And I think it's more of that when it comes to like AI. You can, there is no way you're going to, the cat's out of the bag. There's no way you can stop it. Legislation.
I think it'll be solved mostly with large companies giving large companies money. I think Reddit already gets like hundreds of millions of dollars, or it has received hundreds of millions of dollars for access to its data set in order for models to train against. So maybe that'll come back around the way it is with YouTube, where as a content creator, eventually you make money from some other sources. Maybe AI training, model training will be another thing in addition to advertising or all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I've also heard of a handful of apps that are spinning up around AIs that are, especially around the children issue, like watching what kids are doing online to prevent them going somewhere. So it's literally like a monitor that's being like an overlay as opposed to the thing that's serving them information. It's basically like saying like, oh no, we got to blur this area on the screen, or, dynamically and stuff. Which is
then that leads to other questions, right? Like,
right. Well, I mean, there's a whole Black Mirror about this,
Big
right?
Brother.
Like,
Absolutely. Jane, on back to the sort of the logical progression of AI, really. When do you think, or do you think there will come a time when you will need to use AI in, say, let's say your role, as DevOps SRE, will there come a time when if you don't use AI, you will not be able to function in that role?
I think we're now starting to do that right now in terms of like individual output. So there was a time in my career early on where you'd be tasked with a problem, and you'd sit for a week banging your head against the desk trying to solve it. And the wealth of internet information wasn't good enough, and you'd end up having to read books, or you'd have to go and buy a book and look through it in order to answer a question. And we're now at the point where you can get really fast answers to these with AIs. And I think that will naturally start to weed out the people that are sort of capable of high outputs versus those that sort of muddle along.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty brutal, but I think especially in like a bear market or an IT downturn, like people that can just do more and more and more are going to be recognized within the industry and will do better. But maybe the transparency around that should be there, which is like, I am a developer or I am X engineer, but I am using these tools to kind of like give me the superpowers or the edge to just unblock me as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that AI assisted role. I mean, look, my day job, I'm a copywriter, and I think that to be able to produce content as quickly as needed these days, at the lower rates that are being charged or whatever, or paid these days, you have to use AI in order to make that a sustainable career. Now it's not like it was 2 years ago, even, where you could charge hundreds of pounds to knock out a few hundred words. Now it's you can't do that. You need to do it. You can't take a week to knock out that. You need to knock it out in a day. You need to charge less for it, and it needs to be you just need to have that ability to generate content quicker. I don't know, George, what it's like. Is it like that for you, George? Would you say?
It's starting to get there. I mean, I think there's a couple of tools where I'm trying to embrace as much as I can up front of I'm doing like branding and website work. So there's a couple of tools out there. One of them being Reloom, which is basically an agency out of Australia that realized that they made a tool that was better at like AI wireframing for Webflow and Figma than they were at like producing websites. So they like made this pivot, and it's something where I'm trying to embrace that. Is like, okay, well, if I have this service, then that allows me to maybe instead of like offering just one wireframe to my client, I can say like, well, here's 3 or 4 that came pretty quickly, and kind of go from there, knowing that that time that I would spend on development or whatever is actually being adjusted, in the whole scope, because I have these pieces that I can just drop into place and kind of get everything going. The part that I'm waiting to happen is the creative direction portion that will be taken over, right? Like I'm still making the creative decisions about what this thing looks like, how the website flows, whether or not the outputs that this thing's giving me are anything that my client wants. I imagine it won't be terribly long before that portion will also start to be offset a bit, and it'll, be providing suggestions about why this one might be better or something. Which at a certain point, I think there's always like a learning curve in marketing about new technologies and new methods and trends anyway, that can feel pretty daunting to be behind on. So a tool like that can also offer like, this is what all of the most successful landing pages are doing. And then in 6 months, they'll all look exactly the same, but I guess they'll all be converting or something. So I don't know, it's getting there, but it's yet to be really obvious to me that someone's like, no, I'm going with this, $39.99 tool instead.
Sure.
But I'll keep you posted.
So Mark, how does, obviously we talked about using extensively AI, whether it's local or whether it's whatever, but how does the actual act of using AI make you feel? Like, does it give you that sense of wonder that it sort of did the first time you used it?
Yeah, I mean, whenever I ask a question and I get a really good answer, I always thank the LLM, and it always says like, no problem. And I know that I'm just responding with like a mathematical formula, which is just like,
no, it's a good idea,
predicting things. But like, I can't help but like tell myself like, wow, thanks, man. And it's at any time, and like, it never ceases to like. Going back to what I said in our intro one with the computers that we grew up with using, like what we can actually do now. Like I am just like absolutely bewildered with like how incredible these things are and how we've managed to like fit these in such a small space. Like I know I was going on about file sizes before, but like you go and download like a PS5 game and it's 50 to 100 gigabytes.
Oh wow!
And that's just like some textures and some 3D models. Like you can download a large language model which is like 10 gigabytes in size that will answer like most questions you can come up with. And like to me, that is just absolutely incredible, and how we've got to this point. So yeah, I mean, I'm not that. I think for my children, they'll grow up just taking it for granted. But for me, seeing how far it's come, like I'm just blown away by it constantly, really.
Yeah.
It's interesting that, like, the like you say about the kids gonna get used to it. What a world that's gonna be, when the girls get to be, what are they, 3 now? So when they get to be like 20 or whatever, what a world it's gonna be for them in terms of the technology.
Yeah. I mean,
I assume it's
it
just gonna be
it might be like
vacation, possibly.
Terminator. Like we might all
Yeah, might
be
be.
killed in a Holocaust, but yeah.
When I look back, and the first sort of computer that I really used was like a BBC Micro or was that called BBC Micro at Throckley First School. They had
Yeah.
one, and it was on a big rack, and they would like wheel it different rooms and stuff, and it was real like treat that you got to like use this one single archaic computer, and now like
Yeah, you got told not to touch it. Like computers
yeah
are it was almost
yeah
like, I don't know,
yeah
like a printing press, like with kind of like how adults told you to kind of interact with this computer. And now it's things are so commoditized and ubiquitous that like you can just like throw these things away if they don't work and buy a new one. And
yeah
like how our children and
yeah.
generations are kind of like looking at technology, they just take it for granted. It's like, yeah, it's bonkers, really.
That's good. It is. It's
Yeah.
absolutely crazy. So I guess if we talk about like obviously that technology is changing. Technology is changing everything. Technology is changing like the human experience, and AI is changing the human experience, I guess, to a degree, and a professional experience. So with that in mind, are there any? We've talked a lot about the positives, right? We've talked a lot about the benefits, the things you can do, but do you see any negatives that come with this whole evolution?
I guess you get that like kind of like stickiness when it comes to aligning the good with AI, but also the things that it displaces. So like if you look at, say, like the job searching experience for many people, and like applicant tracking systems, like I know somebody now who's been looking for a job for a long time, and like they're mightily frustrated with AI because they look at it as being an impediment to them being able to make it to an interview, because AI systems are constantly filtering through their CV and pick it in,
Right.
rather than a human being pick it through their CV and come into like a judgment about that person. Like an AI is basically coming to the conclusion in I don't know, a nanosecond that we're not going to proceed unless this person like matches this model. So we're going to have that, which is kind of making making it more difficult for humans. And then in addition to that, we've got the things like call center jobs and like all those sorts of things, which are inevitably going to be put under pressure. So, and I think we talked about it a few weeks ago, which is like these people are not going to be moved into jobs where they get to use AI. They're going to be displaced first, and then they're going to go and have to find new jobs.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
so this is the kind of like capitalism 101, really, which is we're not going to get this like efficient kind of like movement of people to this new world that we're creating. We need to create this new world, otherwise we'd still be like down coal mines digging for coal, especially in the northeast of England where we're from.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be where we are without kind of those people that unfortunately had to lose their jobs and for things to move on. So yeah, the negatives are is that the automation is going to take away that human element, and also it's going to take away a lot of the things that we gated as humans. Like we talked before about kind of the things that we do in our jobs, and some people used to be able to make a career out of doing kind of like low level work, especially in like design work, and then there'd be that like little bit of creative bit on the top that you would also need to do, but a lot of it was just the sort of the donkey work, as we call it. So it's now removing the donkey work, meaning that you need to then start to do more and more creative things, work harder, and use your brain more, rather than just kind of like spend days doing kind of like repetitive tasks.
Yeah, which sometimes is quite nice to do, right? You need to have a balance of both, I guess. Not everyone's at Elon Musk superpower, super brain. Right. You need to have downtimes where you can just plow through some tasks.
But there's also a learning to it, right? Like if you compare it to something like the architecture world, where you would traditionally be drawing the same floor over and over and over, and the person who was drawing it was making like intelligent decisions about how this thing's going to be built because they understand it. Then you get to CAD, where you're starting to just replace all those things, and you have people that are the CAD monkeys that are always doing CAD because they're the ones who know it. Then BIM comes along, and all of a sudden buildings understand, like these models know what they're made of, and they're determining the wall package and how it's drawn and all that. And so now all of those CAD people are now like BIM managers. It's like a whole transition, building information modeling. It's like a whole thing. And now that those whole operators are literally just becoming people who know how to use this one particular software, and that software is now starting to make suggestions about the design based on all these other parameters, right? So it's like there's that loss of knowledge. Like I can't imagine getting into that industry now coming out of school, because you're never being taught how to actually put this thing together and how to actually draw it from your brain of like, I know that this method of overlapping these materials is going to be more waterproof. Where if the thing just always draws it that way, it's like, I guess it's just the person building it that would need to know that.
I
think there's a loss in there, you know?
Yeah. I guess it's a bit like computer science. A lot of people that study computer science learned very low level things like binary. And then at least in my career, I found sometimes I'd find people they didn't like me much because I never did a computer science degree, and I just learned kind of like coding at kind of, I don't know, in the year 2000. Once Microsoft had iterated a bunch of programming languages and produced kind of like a simple version. So I don't think we're gonna get to kind of like Mars and Venus if everybody has to start from kind of like the lowest possible level. Obviously, I do respect that, but yeah, we're gonna have to stand on the shoulders of giants, aren't we? Whether we like it or not, and that's the only thing that's going to free our minds up to do more and more creative things rather than sort of those sort of low level tasks. Really, it sounds quite brutal. And the other thing I would say is once we start to commoditize things like robotics a little bit more, and in other systems that would allow you to automate things like food production or drinks in bars and things like that. That's going to be the next level of displacement. I mean, you see people like these robot bartenders making cocktails in like 30 seconds flat. Like that's somebody's job who makes money from tips. Like
what they could do with them in some of the bars that we go to, because it just takes forever to get a drink, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Robot bouncers, yeah. Once they attach a baseball bat to one of these robots, we're in serious trouble.
That's funny.
Yeah, it is interesting. One of the things I was thinking about as well with the coding, the low level coding, the grunt work and stuff, and it's something, Mark, you and I have talked about as well in the past, is it's the work that we send offshore to a lot of these, like, specifically Indian consultancies, right? Mm-hmm. So, those big consultancies that employ hundreds of thousands of people across in India to do a lot of the grunt work, a lot of the coding, a lot of that, development work that now can just be done. A lot of it can be done with AI. I mean, I've got a real, I really think it's going to affect their economies. To be honest with you, those sort of developing countries. I mean, India's not, is it a developing country? It's a huge economy, right? But anyway, still, I feel like it's going to take a hit. Yeah.
I mean, you had the offshoring, as you described, where you'd set some parameters for a task in the evening, and then you'd send an email, and then in the morning you would expect to see some deliverables. And I mean, I joked to you once that kind of like India was almost like a human AI model, only in terms of like our expectations these days, and like when we interact with a chat GPT, we provide it with a bunch of instructions, and then we get a bunch of outputs back. And that was what we were used to sort of like 20 years ago with offshoring. And I guess like what we could say is like, is offshoring going to become under pressure because of that? But then as you were saying that question, I was just thinking to myself, well, what if our job becomes irrelevant and it's somebody in India who's just using an AI to build things? Because they're the prompt engineers. You don't need to pay someone $100,000 a year in the UK to do something. Right. So yeah, it's like we just don't know, do we? How these things are going to pan out. But yeah,
it's going to be an interesting. It's going to be an interesting time. It's good to learn as much as you can about AI, about machine learning, and adopt it. Which brings me on to the final point, really, which is what advice would you have for anybody who's listening to the podcast, who's I don't know whether it's to do with running local AIs, whether it's just to do with getting any information. Is there any one particular thing that you would say to someone to do?
Yeah, I think. A few of the conversations I picked up on are mostly ring kind of bells in my head around like the mystique of AI and what it can and what it can't do. And I think for me, what I found was learning about it under the hood and running things locally. They let you understand what's going on a little bit more, and then so it's not just they make you realize that it's not just a brain like in a jar somewhere that is thinking about like launching a nuclear attack. Like it is, a lot of these things are just like mathematical equations predicting sort of words and letters in order to do their thing. So I would say that for somebody who's afraid of AI or is kind of fascinated with where it's going to go in the short, medium, and long term, is to actually learn these things for yourself. Like it is so easy to watch a course, to run something locally, and I'm talking about on like a laptop. You don't need a flashy GPU to do it. You can have something running in 10, 20 minutes, really. Like learn a bit more about how these things work under the hood and realize that they're not going to go away. So the best thing to do is to kind of like understand how they work, and then you can start to be part of this future and use these tools to integrate and improve your life rather than kind of being resistant to them, because I think the more resistant you are, the more you're going to get left behind. And these things are nothing to fear. They are going to change a lot of our lives, but I don't think they're anything to be afraid of. They're just something that we're going to have to adapt to as human beings.
It always brings me back to the the Luddites, right? I always think of the parallel of the Luddites. I don't know if you Mark, the Luddites like that. So I always mention this, but I don't know if I explain it to the people listening, to the person listening.
Now's the opportunity. Let's do it.
So it was kind of back in the day when the Industrial Revolution was going on and mills were kind of replacing the craftsmen. There was an uprising of these craftsmen under there was a mythical General Ludd who was apparently some figure that they all looked up to. But what they did was these Luddites who followed the principles of General Ludd was they burnt down the mills, they destroyed the mills because they saw that as the way to protect their jobs, was to stall progress. But obviously that didn't work out for them, and there is no way of stalling progress, and you can't just hope to bash, in this case AI, or to not use AI, to avoid it, to put it down, because you'll end up like the Luddites and become just a historical irrelevance, really.
And also the tools are at our disposal that individuals can advance their own understanding a lot easier than they used to. Like owning a computer, like that used to be something that like some other family had, whereas now you've got a mobile phone. You can learn about anything, anywhere, and you can just take more personal responsibility about kind of like where your life's going and the things that you understand, and don't just put it in the hands of like your employer or a large group, as you described with the Luddites. When you said General Ludd, it just reminded me of General Zod from Superman. He sounded like quite a sinister character.
Yeah, well, I think any general for me, as soon as I hear general, I know obviously George is American, so they love generals and stuff out there.
Yeah, of course, general.
But when I hear anything like that, suspicious. Apart from General Storm Norman, who used to wear his 2 watches, I've got to respect the guy for that. Anyway, never mind.
In case he lost a hand, I'm assuming.
Well, he had one. I think he had a day date or a date just Rolex on one hand, and then he had like some sort of, I don't know, like a Seiko or a Casio or something on the other wrist. So you could have dual times.
Sure, right. He doesn't have your dual time watch that you have.
One was for his dinner date, and the other one was for his missile attack.
There you go.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. George, anything else you want to ask Mark while we've got him on?
No, I mean, Mark, honestly, it's been great having you on here. I'm glad you were able to spend so much time kind of diving into all these intricacies of localization. There's one actually thing, as I mentioned it, you had mentioned a resource to go to find different types of LLMs that you can download. What was that? I think I may have
missed it. Hugging Face. So Hugging Face, just type that into a web browser. It's very, anyone who goes to it for the first time is going to think, what is this? But that is basically where a lot of companies will release their models for free. So that will start you off on your journey to know that there are resources out there that you can get yourself for nothing. And then they can, in combination with like YouTube tutorials and whatnot, they can start you on your journey. But things are just literally just seconds away that you can run yourself locally.
That's awesome. I'm going to check that out later, probably right after this.
Cool. All right, then. Yeah. I think that's it then.
It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thank you.